You won't believe how a single, seemingly ridiculous HOA rule turned my entire neighborhood against me, ruined friendships I thought would last forever, and made me question whether I even belonged in the place I called home. All because of one tiny, harmless thing I did in my own yard. In just a few days, neighbors I had smiled at every morning whispered about me behind my back, stared at me with judgment, and even plotted to punish me. I became the enemy, the villain, the cautionary tale, all over something that seemed completely unfair. And no matter what I did, it felt like the entire community was against me. It started on an ordinary Tuesday morning, the kind of morning when you expect nothing more than a cup of coffee and the quiet sound of birds outside your window. I stepped outside my front door thinking it would be a normal day, but it wasn't. I had placed a small garden gnome beside my porch, a quirky little thing with a crooked hat and a mischievous grin. To me, it was harmless, even charming. To my HOA, apparently it was a crime. A letter slipped under my door, formal and cold, warned me that the gnome violated community standards and must be removed immediately. I laughed at first. Surely they couldn't be serious, a gnome? But I quickly realized that in this neighborhood, rules weren't just rules, they were weapons, tools to control everyone. I ignored the letter for a while, thinking maybe it was a mistake, but the tension grew. Neighbors started whispering as I passed by, glances turned icy, smiles disappeared. Even people I had greeted for years suddenly crossed the street to avoid me. Every interaction became a reminder that I had broken some invisible social contract. And the letters didn't stop, they escalated. The next one threatened fines, hundreds of dollars, for my so-called violation. I felt disbelief mixed with anger. How could such a tiny, innocent thing cause this much chaos? But the room was cold, filled with neighbors staring at me like I was an intruder. The president read a long statement about community uniformity and protecting property values, without letting me speak. I wanted to shout, to demand fairness, but the words got stuck in my throat. After that, my world became a battleground. I realized that this was no longer about a gnome, it was about control. Neighbors started documenting me, taking pictures, whispering to each other, and sharing stories that painted me as reckless or disrespectful. Even friends stopped visiting, worried about being caught in the drama, and yet I refused to remove the gnome. Part of me wanted to stand up for myself, to defend my right to live without constant judgment. One Saturday morning, things came. When I refused, arguments erupted. Accusations flew, not just about the gnome, but about my character, my sense of decency, and my place in the community. It was surreal. I watched as my neighborhood, the place I had once loved, seemed to close in on me, every glance and whisper a reminder that I was alone in this fight. But I also realized that this wasn't just about a gnome, it was about individuality. And even as the tension built, even as the hostility grew, I knew that giving in was not an option. With the gnome still in place and my resolve hardening, I took a deep breath, knowing the battle had only just begun, and that what seemed like a small fight over a garden decoration would soon expose secrets, betrayals, and shocking truths that would make the whole neighborhood question everything they thought they knew. By the time the weekend rolled around, the tension in my neighborhood had reached a boiling point. I had thought ignoring the letters and avoiding confrontation might calm things down, but the opposite happened. Every glance from a neighbor felt like a judgment. Every whispered conversation behind closed doors seemed to center on me, on that gnome, and on how much of a threat I had become. It was exhausting, not just mentally, but emotionally. The once friendly faces that lined our streets were now shields of suspicion and disapproval. Even small things like the way someone adjusted their mail or the way a car slowed as it passed my house felt like a public reminder that I was being watched, analyzed, and in their eyes condemned. I started noticing patterns in the gossip. Neighbors would whisper stories to one another that seemed only loosely based in reality. My disobedience was suddenly exaggerated into acts I hadn't even committed. Some claimed I was flaunting the rules intentionally, as if I were trying to provoke everyone. Others spread the rumor that my yard was a mess, though it had been neat and well kept for years. Every morning, the energy of the neighborhood, shifted like a storm cloud overhead, charged with silent tension that left me constantly on edge. I tried to focus on my own life, on work and small joys, but the whispers and looks followed me everywhere. I felt trapped in my own home, a place that had once been a sanctuary. The HOA didn't just stop at letters and passive-aggressive notes. One afternoon, I found small flyers taped to street signs in my mailbox, even slipped under doors. They were polite on the surface, but carried pointed messages. Community standards are for everyone. Please respect them, and ignoring rules harms all residents. I knew who was behind them, though no one would admit it. Each flyer made me feel smaller, isolated, and more aware of how much power the HOA and a few of the most judgmental neighbors wielded over our supposedly peaceful streets. I began documenting everything, snapping photos of the flyers, the glares, even the unspoken moments of confrontation, hoping that having evidence might somehow give me leverage if things escalated further, and escalate they did. I woke up one morning to find that someone had left a note on my gnome itself. It was short, almost childish, but heavy with meaning. You're not welcome here. This was personal. I realized then that the battle was no longer about a silly lawn decoration. It had become a fight for respect, for dignity, and for the right to live in my own home without fear of constant judgment. My mind raced with questions. How had a simple gnome turned into this? And how far would people go to enforce rules that were, frankly, ridiculous? I decided I needed allies, someone who could support me or at least see the absurdity of the situation. I tried reaching out to neighbors I had once been close with, explaining calmly, logically, that the gnome was harmless and that the escalating hostility was unnecessary. Some nodded politely, but the majority shook their heads or offered vague. It felt like trying to argue with a wall. The social isolation grew heavier each day, but so did my determination. I refused to remove the gnome. It had become a symbol, not of rebellion, but of standing up for fairness. Then came the day that changed everything, the day a group of neighbors decided to take matters into their own hands. I had just returned from work when I noticed a small crowd gathered near my house. I could see them whispering, pointing, and glancing in my direction. My stomach sank. They wanted to intimidate me, to force me into submission. I took a deep breath and stepped onto my porch, ready to face them, ready to defend myself and my choices, though I had no idea what form their confrontation would take. The leader of the group, Standards, stepped forward. Her tone was calm but firm, almost rehearsed. She told me I had caused a disturbance in the neighborhood, that I had ignored multiple notices, and that my actions were disrespectful. The crowd murmured in agreement with her statements, and I realized that my words had little effect. Neighbors would block paths, stop to glare at me during walks, and whisper loudly enough for me to hear. I remember one block party where I felt the stares like daggers. Children avoided me, adults whispered in corners, and the energy in the air was thick with tension. Was I being unreasonable? Was I overreacting? I returned from work to find that someone had tampered with my mailbox, scattering letters on the ground. Among them were more HOA notices, but also anonymous messages filled with judgment and warnings. One read, "Next time, it won't just be a note." I felt a surge of fear and anger. This had gone far beyond civility. I considered leaving the neighborhood, moving somewhere anonymous where no one knew my name or judged my choices, but something inside me refused. Leaving would mean letting them win. As the days turned into weeks, I noticed subtle acts of sabotage aimed at me and my property. Garden. Tools were misplaced, fences were examined and criticized, and small rumors circulated about me that weren't true. It was relentless. I realized that in trying to enforce conformity, the FO and a few determined neighbors had created an environment of fear and hostility. I felt trapped in a web of social punishment, each thread tightening around me. And yet the gnome remained. In its place, a silent declaration that I would not be bullied into submission. By now, the story of my struggle had begun spreading beyond our street. Friends in other communities asked if I was okay, offering sympathy and disbelief. Social media posts hinted at the absurdity of my situation, and I started to gain quiet support from people who had no stake in the HOA's petty rules but understood the injustice. Even as I faced daily hostility, I felt a small flicker of empowerment. This was no longer just about a gnome. It was about fairness, about standing up to arbitrary authority. Despite these small victories, the neighborhood continued to close in. Every morning brought a new challenge, every encounter. A reminder that I was being judged, watched, and pushed to my limits. The intimidation and the unfair treatment. I knew that if the battle was going to continue, and it would, I needed evidence to stand my ground and expose the absurdity and cruelty of those who sought to control every aspect of life in our so-called peaceful community. Little did I know, the events of these weeks were only the beginning. The conflict that started over a single gnome was about to escalate further, revealing shocking alliances, betrayals, and truths that would shake the entire neighborhood to its core. And though I didn't yet realize it, the gnome in my yard had become the symbol of a larger struggle, one that would test the limits of patience, courage, and the meaning of community itself. The tension had reached a breaking point. My gnome remained firmly in place, a small but defiant reminder that I wouldn't let fear dictate my life. Yet, as I walked my yard one morning, nervous, curious, and cautious, I approached, ready for whatever confrontation might come next. What I discovered that day would change everything. It started with a quiet conversation. One neighbor, someone I had always thought was aligned with the HOA's strict enforcement, pulled me aside and spoke in hushed tones. "There's more going on than just the rules." My heart raced. She explained that the HOA had been hiding disputes over property, hidden agendas, and personal grudges. Protect their own interests or manipulate the neighborhood's perception. I felt a mix of anger, disbelief, and relief. Anger that my neighbors had allowed personal politics to masquerade as rules, disbelief that such cruelty had been orchestrated over trivialities, and relief that at last someone was telling the truth. This revelation reframed everything: the gnome, the notes, the whispers. It had never really been about conformity. It had been about power. And I realized that if I wanted peace, I couldn't just defend myself. System that had allowed this harassment to fester. Armed with new information and documentation I had been collecting, I decided to confront the HOA formally. The glares were as sharp as ever, but I ignored them, letting my evidence speak for itself. I detailed every act of harassment, every overreach of authority, and every manipulation of the community to serve personal agendas. I spoke calmly, logically, and with undeniable proof. At first, there was stunned silence. The president of the HOA tried to dismiss my claims, calling them exaggerated and misunderstood. Some neighbors, emboldened by the facts, began nodding, murmuring, and even questioning past actions. What had seemed like a united front against me was cracking. The evidence was undeniable. Photos, notes, and first-hand accounts painted a clear picture of unfair treatment. And slowly, the truth began to emerge. It turned out that several neighbors had personal grudges against me, some dating back to minor disagreements, others to perceived slights. They had weaponized the HOA rules to isolate me, spread fear, and once this truth came out, others began to speak up. Whispers became conversations. Conversations became acknowledgments of wrongdoing. And for the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of hope that the hostility might finally subside. The gnome, which had started all this, suddenly felt symbolic of more than just defiance. It represented courage, integrity, and standing up against unfairness. I realized that by holding my ground, I had forced the neighborhood to confront its own hypocrisy and the misuse of authority. The HOA's credibility began to unravel, and those who had orchestrated the campaign against me found themselves exposed. The power they thought they wielded was crumbling, replaced by a newfound awareness among the community that fairness and transparency mattered far more than arbitrary conformity. Over the next few days, apologies began to trickle in. Some neighbors admitted they had been influenced by gossip without understanding the truth. Others expressed regret for letting personal biases dictate their actions. Slowly, the social isolation began to lift, replaced by cautious attempts at reconciliation. It wasn't immediate, and it wasn't perfect, but it was progress. I felt a sense of belonging returning. I also realized that the gnome had become a sort of legend in the neighborhood. Reminder of the absurdity of blind adherence to rules and the importance of standing up for oneself. Children who had once avoided me began to wave again. Even neighbors who had been skeptical or critical started smiling and engaging in conversations. The transformation was subtle but real. My defiance had sparked awareness, encouraged accountability, and reminded everyone that community isn't just about rules, it's about respect, fairness, and humanity. Reflecting on everything, I understood that this ordeal had been far more than a battle over a gnome. It had tested my patience, my courage, and my ability to remain steadfast in the face of overwhelming opposition. I had learned who my true allies were, who could be swayed by truth, and how fragile reputations and authority can be when they are built on fear and deception. It was a profound lesson in human behavior, social dynamics, and the power of standing firm for what is right. By the end, the HOA had begun reforming its processes, ensuring transparency and fairness in enforcement. Rules were clarified, grievances were taken seriously, and residents were encouraged to communicate openly rather than rely on gossip or intimidation. I had helped create change, not just for myself, but for everyone in the neighborhood. The gnome remained in my yard, now a celebrated symbol of integrity rather than rebellion. And as I stood on my porch one evening, looking out over the street that had once felt like a battlefield, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in months. The whispers had turned into conversations, the glares into smiles, and the fear into understanding. It hadn't been easy, and it hadn't been quick, but standing up for myself had transformed not only my life, but the life of the entire community. The gnome had started a war, yes, but it had ended in justice, growth, and reconciliation. I realized, finally, that sometimes the smallest acts of courage can trigger the biggest changes. A simple garden gnome had forced an entire neighborhood to examine its values, confront its biases, and learn the importance of empathy and fairness. And in that moment, I understood something essential, that no matter how absurd a rule may seem, the fight for dignity, respect, and truth is always worth it. As night fell, and the lights of the houses glimmered softly, I smiled at my gnome, grateful for the chaos it had caused and the lessons it had taught. The battle had been hard, the conflict intense, and the journey exhausting, but the outcome was beyond anything I could have imagined. I had reclaimed my home, my peace, and my voice, and the neighborhood, once divided and harsh, had begun to heal, learning that true community is measured not by rules, but by the courage, fairness, and compassion of its people.